Okay, so today we're going deep, really deep into something that's incredibly complex and unfortunately still happening right now.
Yeah.
The Sudanese Civil War, which has been going on for decades.
It has.
You know, when we first got the analysis for this one, it's like looking at a maze of history. We're talking about struggles across what, like 3 generations now?
Yeah.
So we want to, like, I don't know, give you guys a clear pass through it.
Right. And to understand it, you have to realize it's not one war, it's a whole series of wars, all connected.
Right.
So looking at each phase helps you understand what's going on right now.
Exactly. Our goal for you today is to pull out those crucial insights,
Yeah.
like the core reasons this conflict keeps going without getting lost in all the details,
All right.
like a shortcut to the big picture, right?
Absolutely.
And luckily, our analysis breaks it down into 4 main periods.
Okay.
The First Sudanese Civil War, that started way back in 1955.
Mm-hmm.
Then the Second Sudanese Civil War. Then the Darfur Conflict, which crazily is still going on in some form.
Yeah.
And finally, the 2023 Sudan War, which is just devastating.
It is.
And I think as we go through this, you'll see these like striking connections and themes that keep popping up.
You will, yeah.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning.
Okay, so if we're going to the beginning, then logically we start with the First Sudanese Civil War.
Right.
From 1955 to 1972, you see this conflict. Its roots are really deep in the colonial period.
Right. This is when Sudan was like jointly run by Britain and Egypt.
Yeah, it was.
Which had a huge impact on like all the politics and administration.
Uh-huh.
And when Sudan finally got its independence in 56, it feels like all the power went straight to the Arab Muslim North.
Absolutely, and that's key for you to understand.
Yeah.
Because this concentration of power, it created this dynamic where the African Christian and Animist South felt sidelined.
Yeah.
Politically and economically. This unequal distribution of power right from the get-go, that's a theme that keeps coming back.
Right. So it wasn't just about power, though, right? It was also about, like, the North pushing for a super Islamic identity for the whole country.
Yeah. And that obviously didn't sit well with the South.
Of course not. They had their own distinct cultures and religions.
Exactly.
So that tension between this Islamic state thing and the South's like resistance, their desire for autonomy, their desire to be recognized, that became like this major fault line.
That's a great way to put it.
And when the new government like refused to grant them any autonomy, it's almost like they lit the fuse.
They really did.
For the whole rebellion, which led to, well, that 1955 mutiny in the South, which really started the whole war.
Yeah.
And then we see the Anyanya movement emerging as the main Southern rebel group.
Right.
Fighting against the government. 17 years of conflict.
17 years.
A long time.
It is. It is. And that eventually led, at least for a while, to a moment of hope with the Addis Ababa Agreement in 1972.
Right.
And this agreement, you see, it actually gave the South a degree of, regional autonomy.
So like an end to all the bloodshed.
Right.
But the human cost. Over 500,000 people died.
It was huge. Absolutely tragic.
It was.
And you see the Addis Ababa Agreement, while it did stop the fighting for a while, it didn't really solve anything.
Yeah.
The tensions about identity, power, resources, they were still there.
Simmering.
Exactly, simmering under the surface. And this is something to remember.
Yeah.
Temporary agreements without actually fixing the root causes, it often just delays things.
Right. Kicks the can down the road.
Yeah, and this lack of real change, it meant the potential for conflict was always there.
Which takes us to the Second Sudanese Civil War, starting in 1983.
Yep.
It seems like whatever progress they made, it was undone so quickly.
Yeah.
What happened? What was the trigger this time?
Well, in '83, President Numeri made a big decision.
Okay.
He revoked Southern autonomy, the thing they fought so hard for in the Addis Ababa Agreement.
Oh, wow.
And he also imposed Sharia law across the entire country.
So, like, one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Yeah.
Not taking into account the different cultures and beliefs.
And for the South, which was mostly non-Muslim, this was like a slap in the face.
Right.
A clear sign the North still wanted to dominate them.
And this time, it wasn't just about religion and culture, was it?
No, it wasn't.
The analysis you gave me also mentioned, like, economic factors getting more and more important.
Yeah.
Especially with them discovering oil in the South.
Right, and that oil wealth, that added a whole new level of complexity.
Right.
It made the fight for control of the region even more intense.
Okay, so we're seeing resource disputes starting to become a big thing now.
Yeah, absolutely.
And from this renewed conflict, we see the SPLA emerging, the Sudan People's Liberation Army, led by John Garang.
Yeah.
They were like the main rebel force this time around.
They were.
And they even had outside support, didn't they?
They did. Countries like Ethiopia and Uganda backed them.
So now we're seeing other countries getting involved, making the conflict even more messy.
Exactly.
It's interesting, how outside forces can make things worse, but they could also help solve things. So this second war, it sounds even more brutal than the first.
It was really bad. It was a devastating guerrilla war.
And this is where the Darfur conflict starts brewing, right? Almost like a side effect.
Yeah, that's a crucial connection to make.
Right.
The government, fighting the SPLA, started supporting this militia called the Janjaweed in Darfur.
Okay.
At first, it was just a local problem, but it set the stage for the huge violence that would come later.
Right. So one conflict feeds into another.
Exactly.
It's crazy. But eventually, there were more peace talks, which led to the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in 2005.
The CPA.
The CPA, yeah.
That was a big deal.
Right.
It ended the Second Sudanese Civil War, but it also gave South Sudan the right to decide their own future.
Right, which led to them voting for independence in 2011.
Yeah.
But again, the cost, 2 million people dead.
Yeah.
Mostly from starvation and disease, 4 million displaced.
It's heartbreaking.
It is. It's just, wow. And while the CPA was huge, the fact that South Sudan felt they had to split off just shows how badly Sudan failed at creating a fair and unified country.
Yeah, exactly. The need for secession, it highlights those unresolved core issues.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about the Darfur conflict now.
Okay.
It has its roots in the Second War, but it really blew up in 2003. And sadly, it's still going on today in some form.
It is.
What's different here is that it's not just a North-South thing.
Right.
Our analysis points to the government in Khartoum favoring certain Arab tribes in Darfur while neglecting the African groups living there.
The Fur, the Maslit, the Zagawa.
Yeah.
And here we see another layer of complexity. Climate change and the lack of resource.
All right.
Desertification in the region.
Right.
It led to competition for land and water between the Arab herders who move around and the African farmers who stay in one place.
Makes sense.
So you have these old ethnic tensions, and then you add the pressure of a changing environment.
It's like a pressure cooker.
Exactly.
And from this, rebel groups in Darfur started forming.
Yep.
Groups like the Sudan Liberation Army and the Justice and Equality Movement.
Right.
What were they fighting for?
They wanted more rights
Okay.
to be included politically and for the marginalization to stop.
So what you're saying is sometimes these local conflicts, they're actually about bigger issues.
Yeah, like how the country's run and whether resources are shared fairly.
Right. And the government's reaction to these rebels, brutal.
It was.
They basically unleashed the Janjaweed militia.
They did. Armed them and funded them.
Yeah.
And they went on this horrible campaign of ethnic cleansing against the non-Arab people in Darfur.
Wow. And the scale of it all, over 300,000 people killed and millions forced from their homes.
Yeah, million.
Horrible. This is what led the International Criminal Court, the ICC, to issue an arrest warrant for President al-Bashir.
Yep, back in 2009.
For genocide.
Yeah.
So the world recognized how bad things were in Darfur.
They did.
But the sad thing is, even after the Second War officially ended and the ICC got involved, Darfur's still unstable and violent.
It is.
And this has hurt Sudan's economy, right?
Absolutely. With sanctions and being isolated internationally.
Yeah. So now we're at the most recent tragedy.
The 2023 Sudan War.
Yeah, it feels like a whole new chapter of violence.
It does.
But with those echoes of the past, what would you say caused this latest conflict?
Well, the immediate cause is this power struggle between two military groups.
Okay.
The Sudanese Armed Forces, led by General al-Burhan.
Right.
And the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, led by Hamedti Ahmed Hamdan Dagalo.
Right.
A powerful paramilitary group.
And aren't these the same guys who were part of that temporary government?
Yeah.
After Omar al-Bashir was ousted in 2019.
They are.
And then they staged a coup in 2021.
Yeah.
So that attempt at democracy just completely crumbled.
Yeah. The hope for a civilian government after all that authoritarian rule, it was gone.
Right.
And the coup just made the tension between the army and the RSF worse.
It created a power vacuum.
It did.
And everyone's fighting for control.
Yeah.
And here we go again with resources and power.
Yeah.
Both the SAF and the RSF want control of Sudan's wealth.
The gold mines, the oil revenue.
Right, all that stuff we talked about before.
Exactly. Control over these resources, it's a major reason for this conflict.
Yeah, it always comes back to that.
It does.
And then the fighting starts in April 2023.
Right.
Not just in some far-off region, but in Khartoum, the capital, and across Darfur.
Right.
The RSF is taking over key cities, and the army's bombing them from the air.
It's terrible.
It's terrifying, and the human cost is already huge.
It is. Your analysis is right. Over 12,000 deaths already.
Wow.
And millions displaced.
Great.
Yeah. Within Sudan.
Yeah.
And fleeing to other countries.
It's hard to wrap your head around that kind of suffering.
It really is.
And now Sudan's teetering on the edge of total collapse.
Yeah.
No real government in control.
Right.
And it's not just affecting Sudan, right? It's spilling over into neighboring countries.
Absolutely. Destabilizing whole regions.
So one country's problem becomes everyone's problem.
It does.
Yeah.
And the international community's trying to get a ceasefire, but nothing's really working.
So we've gone through this whole history now.
Yep.
From 1955 to today.
A long time.
It is. What are the main things you see?
The recurring things driving this conflict.
Yeah, the things that just keep this cycle of violence going.
5 things stand out.
Okay.
First, the deep ethnic and religious divisions that have been there since independence.
Right.
Second, Sudan's history of military rule, which has prevented a stable and inclusive government from forming.
Makes sense.
Third, the economic struggles and the fact that the country's wealth isn't shared fairly. Fourth, the involvement of other countries that have supported different sides, often making the conflicts last longer.
Right, meddling.
And fifth, the failure of peace agreements in the past, and no one really enforcing them.
It's a bleak list.
It is.
And looking ahead, what could happen?
What are the possibilities?
Yeah.
Well, the biggest worry right now is the humanitarian crisis getting worse.
Right.
If these peace talks don't work.
Yeah.
And beyond that, there's a chance Sudan could break apart even more.
Oh, wow.
Into areas controlled by different warlords.
That would be chaotic.
It would. And then there's the possibility of other countries getting even more involved.
Right.
Sending in peacekeepers or, even worse, more weapons.
Which could make the conflict even worse.
Exactly.
It's not a good outlook.
No, it's not.
This whole thing, Sudan's civil wars, it's a tragic and complicated cycle.
It is.
It makes you think, how can these deep-rooted historical, political, economic factors keep fueling conflict?
Yeah.
And what would it take to break free?
It's a big question.
It is.
And to find lasting peace in Sudan, it will probably require a fair and inclusive political system.
Right.
One that really addresses the concerns of all its diverse people.
That's the key takeaway. How do you create a system that works for everyone?
Yeah.
So we've done a deep dive into this really important issue, haven't we?
We have.
From the very beginning to where things stand now.
Yeah.
And we hope this has given you a better understanding of what's driving the Sudanese Civil War, giving you some insights without making you feel totally overwhelmed by how long and awful these conflicts have been.
Right.
We encourage you to keep learning about this.
Yeah.
And other complex global issues.
It's important.
It is, more than ever.
Yep.
Who knows? Maybe our next deep dive will be about something you're interested in.
Maybe.
Until then, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.